The next extreme habitat we're talking about in chapter 15 is ultra-oligotrophic habitats. And you know, globally, this is quite important habitat because so much of the open ocean is very low nutrient. And one of my colleagues, now deceased, from Oregon State University, said most bacteria are starving most of the time. So adaptation to low carbon or other nutrients is sort of the norm. And we'll talk about this also in terms of groundwater habitats as well. And some of these lakes, like Crater Lake, the one behind me, and Waldo Lake, I'll talk about in a sec, carbonate is so low that mollusks can't build their shells. They can't survive. They just don't have enough ions there. And organisms have to adapt to grow very slowly and live longer. So this is an example, Waldo Lake, of an ultra-oligotrophic lake. It's one of the cleanest lakes in the world. Again, it's in Oregon, and it has a very small watershed. And this part of Oregon is, in Western Oregon, receives a huge amount of precipitation. So it's just washing through everything really, really quickly, and it's leaching all the nutrients out of the soils for a long period of time. So this lake is about 6 miles long. And when I was a graduate student, we sailed the entire length of the lake with my advisor, and we pulled a plankton net, and we got one insect leg in that toe, no zooplankton, no phytoplankton that we could detect. And then I was looking for picophytoplankton, which are bacteria-sized plankton, and I was able to put 4 liters of water through a 2.5 millimeter 0.2 micron filter, which is, I mean, we could maybe get a mil or 2 of Tuttle Creek water through. So it's just incredibly clean water. And it also has these interesting cyanobacterial benches. So we think about cyanobacteria living in ultra eutrophic habitat, hyper-eutrophic habitats and cyanobacterial blooms, but these benthic cyanobacteria grow on the bottom and create these benches or mat kind of things and hold everything together. They must grow very slowly, and they have very low rates of photosynthesis. Yeah, so clean, I thought clear water is a good thing. Clean, yes. Yeah, I mean, it is a good thing. I mean, I think it's a, this lake would be irreplaceable. And there's a concern because they've put a campground in there, and people, you know, basically use a septic system. So it would become more eutrophic, and it's an absolutely unique system. There's pressure. People have thought about even fertilizing it. They try to introduce trout into this lake repeatedly, and there's no food for them, so they just don't reproduce, and you know, that's that. So it depends on what you value, I suppose. I value ultra-oligotrophic lake. Oregon State University oceanographers actually use the lake to look at the properties of water, because the water is so clear. They can look at the light properties of transmission properties of pure. It's like a big bowl of distilled water, basically, giant bowl of distilled water. And then we talked about the pitcher plants briefly before the last lecture. Many wetlands are fairly oligotrophic, particularly low nitrogen. And now you know the reason why they might lose nitrogen, because they can have anoxic sediments, right? And so what nitrogen flux might deplete the nitrogen and compete for nitrogen and cause it to leave the system. And it's a process that uses nitrate to oxidize organic carbon and yields nitrogen gas. Anybody remember the name of that? Almost, Emma. You just need to be a little bit more D about it. Denitrification, good. Okay, got it. So yeah, denitrification. Wetlands are a way to strip nitrogen out of systems, and people can even use them for sewage treatment. But these systems are losing nitrogen all the time. Then they can be fed by rainwater, so the plants are fairly nutrient limited. And these pitcher plants trap insects. The insect gets up underneath the edge of it, and then they basically have a clearish part up along the top. So they crawl towards that thinking they can get away from if they get stuck in there, and then they can't. And so then they end up going down in there, and often then they'll have hairs that kind of make it so it's really hard for the insects to get back up again. And they're not using them for carbon, they're using them for the nutrient when they die in the water. And there's water inside of this pitcher. That's why they call them a pitcher, like a pitcher you'd hold water in. And they break down and release their nutrients. This includes not only the pitcher plants, but the Venus flytraps that you may have seen, and some bromeliads do this, as well as sundews, which are they have a blob of sticky stuff that the insects get stuck on. Lane, you raised your hand?
Sorry, I stepped away for a second, but can these plants also uptake nutrients from their roots?
Yeah, they can, but it's just so low that the supplement helps them compete really well.
Okay.
And one of the other things is that these are fairly endangered plants, many of them, because people collect them and take them home and try to grow them, but they can't, so they'll rather than reproduce them themselves. So some of the species are kind of weedy and they're fine, but there's been a lot of pressure on the sundews and the Venus flytraps and such. Just people go out and dig them out of the wetlands and then sell them. So that's been a problem in conservation as well. This particular one is on in Western Oregon, and it's very close to the lakes, Lane, that you talked about. It's the lake Wollahink that you just talked about in your paper report is just over a couple sand dunes from here, actually. So it's still ultra-oligotrophic, and it's a protected area that you can go into. Next habitat, deep subsurface habitats. And they all appear to be inhabited by microbes as long as there's liquid water. And it gets hotter and hotter as you get deeper, right? So at some point, because of volcanic magma activity, there just can't be anything because there can't be liquid water anymore. They can be found to depths of at least 940 meters. Fungi are rare. Bacteria and archaea dominant, and the top predators are oftentimes protozoa in the really deep subsurface. These are ultra-oligotrophic habitats. So they've found active microbes in waters that have been isolated for 1,200 years. And they've used carbon dating methods to date the age of the carbon in that system. So they know that there has not been external carbon input into the system. And that means the doubling time of these microbes has to be around 1,000 years because they couldn't be growing any faster. So you think of bacteria as growing very quickly, but some of these ultra-oligotrophic bacteria grow incredibly slowly. And one of the interesting things in this is that there's some that may run off of only methanogenesis. That is, hydrogen and carbon dioxide can come off the rocks, and it's very low redox, so they can generate energy from methanogenesis. This is the only ecosystem on Earth not ultimately dependent upon photosynthesis. So even those sulfur caves that were in the book, where the sulfide is coming out of the groundwater and then the sulfur oxidizing bacteria are chemoautotrophic, they have to use the oxygen that comes from photosynthesis. Even those deep sea vents that you see that are all with volcanic water coming in and sulfur oxidizing bacteria and clams and all that stuff, they still need the oxygen from photosynthesis, but this is the one place. These are probably some of the simplest microbial communities, or of any type of communities on Earth. So when we talk about humans impacting the entire global environment, it's almost completely true, except for probably these deep subsurface habitats are insulated enough from humans' activity on the surface that there's no direct effect on them. Water surface layer, neuston or microbes and on the surface, and the macroorganisms are the plueston. And there's a whole series of organisms that are adapted to living in this area. It's a unique chemical and biological habitat. It's good for insects and such because they can, there's stuff that falls in on the surface so they can pick stuff off, right? But there's also protozoa and bacteria that grow, phytoplankton, I guess you'd call them, neuston, that grow right on the surface of there, and they have a way to get stuck on it. It's extreme because it's a really high light habitat, And also many organisms such as Daphnia or other phytoplankton, if they get trapped in that surface tension, they're done and they'll never come back. So for example, when I was working on Flathead Lake, we'd have big storms, turn up the water and the Daphnia would be all stuck up on the surface tension and they couldn't get off, and so they just died and the fish would go pick them all off. Really interesting adaptation to this is Velia caprea uses a chemical that lowers the water tension, and it can use that to actually locomote up to 10 centimeters per second. So behind it, it dumps the chemical, right? And then, so there's no water tension behind it. And in front of it, the water tension then pulls it forward, because otherwise the water tension is pulling in all directions. So that's a really interesting adaptation to this habitat. And here's some of the organisms that are at the surface. We have the mosquito larvae. Maybe some of you that have aquaria have seen snails that are able to actually crawl upside down on the surface tension and glean stuff off the surface of the water. This is a cladoceran related to Daphnia that does inhabit, and it gleans from below. It sticks up on that surface there and gleans from below. Beetles, then we have the water striders that you may know of. And then here's a series of algae and protozoa that are much smaller that are able to grow on that. And they have these little cups or something that kind of keep them right there. So if they can adapt to that high light, they may be getting more nutrients and some inputs from terrestrial systems that help them survive.